Greek and Roman philosophy after Aristotle. Cynicism, Epicureanism, Stoicism, and Skepticism. 7.5 centuries lie between the deaths of Alexander the Great and St. Augustine of Hippo. Alexander died in 323 BCE, Augustine in 430 CE. Historians divide this long stretch of time into two main periods, the Hellenistic and the Imperial. Alexander's death marks the end of the classical period and the beginning of the Hellenistic period, while the end of the latter is placed at the start of Augustus Caesar's principate in 27 BCE, which inaugurates the imperial period. 400 years later, in the lifetime of St. Augustine, Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, and for more than the next 1,000 years, philosophy was almost exclusively subordinated to the demands of Christian doctrine and church authority. The four most notable philosophical schools in the Hellenistic and Imperial period, apart from the already existing Academy of Plato and briefly at the outset, Peripatetic school of Aristotle, were the Epicurean, Stoic, Cynic, and Neoplatonist schools. Though it would be wrong to call the Cynics a school in any organized sense, here the word has its informal meaning of an outlook or tradition of thought. Aristotle's school, a formal one, dwindled away not long after his death because its main followers, like Aristotle himself, left Athens and settled in various parts of the Hellenic world, so that for a number of centuries the school's teaching ceased to be influential. In the 3rd century BCE, Plato's academy fell under the influence of skeptical thinkers, though it survived as an institution until 529 CE, when the Emperor Justinian abolished it and forbade the teaching of what he called pagan philosophy. For most of this period, the Epicurean and Stoic schools were dominant. Cynicism was a minority commitment in terms of adherence, but it influenced the formation of Stoicism, and in fact lasted considerably longer than Stoicism and Epicureanism, some people still claiming to be Cynics in the 5th century CE. This was chiefly because after its founding by Antisthenes, Cynicism was an exclusive ethical outlook and way of life with no logical, epistemic, or cosmological theories involved. It therefore encapsulates in purest form an interesting major feature of philosophy in this period, which is its greater focus on achieving ataraxia, or peace of mind. One reason why this concern came to greater prominence alongside the philosophical aims already well established of understanding the world and achieving the good life is arguably the greater insecurity of Hellenic times. The loss of civic autonomy under the empires of Alexander and Rome, and the need felt by people to seek within themselves for a sense of security and stability that outer events could not guarantee. Whatever the prompt for it, philosophy increasingly came to target the question of how to strengthen the inner psychological resources of the individual so that he or she can achieve ataraxia, or peace of mind. One might also want to think here of Epictetus. The writings of Seneca, Cicero, and Marcus Aurelius, and the teachings of Epictetus are classics of this trend. Although Cynicism, Epicureanism, and Stoicism are the principal movements of thought in the Hellenic and Roman periods until the rise of Neoplatonism, their roots lie in the lifetime of Socrates. The founding figures of Cynicism, Antisthenes and Diogenes, were contemporaries of Plato, and Antisthenes was a pupil, or more accurately perhaps companion of Socrates. Democritus the atomist, whose views provided an inspiration for Epicurus, was likewise a contemporary of Socrates and Plato. Although the founder of Stoicism, Zeno of Citium, lived nearly a century later, he was a child of 8 when Aristotle died in 322 BCE. His school shared these Socratic roots. He was influenced by the Cynics, who had taken their cue from the hardier and more convention-opposing aspects of Socrates' outlook and style of life. Accordingly, Stoicism, which came to claim the adherence of almost all educated Romans for centuries, and had one of its most eloquent voices in the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, or Caracalla, in the 2nd century CE, is also appropriately seen as an outcome of the Socratic movement. Cynicism. The Cynics thought to live according to nature and in opposition to convention. The most famous of them, Diogenes of Sinope, known better as Diogenes the Cynic, took these commitments to their logical limit. He went about naked, slept in a barrel, masturbated in public, saying that he wished hunger was as easily appeased by rubbing the stomach, and carried a lantern in broad daylight, remarking, when asked why he did so, that he was looking for a man, and adding that he had once seen some boys in Sparta, the point being that the way of life there was less effete than in Athens. Diogenes was not, however, the founder of Cynicism, though he was its most dramatic exemplar. Diogenes Laertius describes the movement's origin to Antisthenes and his views to the example set by one side of Socrates' outlook and style of life. Antisthenes was born in Athens and lived between 445 and 365 BCE. He had begun his education with Gorgias the sophist, becoming a highly accomplished speaker as a result, but switched to his adherence to Socrates on being persuaded that virtue is the source of happiness and that the route to virtue lies through asceticism. Antisthenes believed that virtue can be taught and requires nothing but the strength of a Socrates, that is, courage and self-command. Virtue is ennobling, he said. It expresses itself in deeds and requires few words. Anyone good deserves to be loved, and how one acts should be dictated by the laws of virtue, whether or not they conform to the laws of the polis. These two latter views are such as an outsider would be well placed to form. Antisthenes was a nothos, or bastard-born, because his parents were not married. His mother was, moreover, a Thracian, so he did not have Athenian citizenship. His follower Diogenes undoubtedly acquired from Antisthenes a dislike for the aristocratic Plato. Antisthenes accused Plato of pride and conceit, once remarking to him on seeing a spirited horse capering in a procession, "If you were a steed, you would be just such a proud, showy one." The list of Antisthenes' book is long, though very little remains of what he actually wrote. His influence on those who both followed and furthered his example, Diogenes the Cynic, Crates of Thebes, and Zeno of Citium, who founded Stoicism, is what justifies his nomination as founder of the school. Diogenes Laertius said that he, quote, gave the impulse to the indifference of Diogenes, the continence of Crates, and the hardihood of Zeno, end quote. Indifference to convention and conventional ambitions, continence and hardihood are the essentials of the cynical outlook. The Stoics shared the two latter characteristics, but what made them markedly different was that they cared about their duties to society. Antisthenes embraced poverty in the aesthetic life, and it was claimed that the symbols of adherence to cynicism, a ragged cloak, a staff and a wallet or small bag, originated with him, some say with Diogenes. The idea that the only thing you need by way of a bed is a folded cloak is certainly attributed to him. Diogenes the Cynic, as noted, took the idea of spurning convention and living according to nature to its limit. Born in 412 BCE at Sinope on the Black Sea, he lived for nearly 90 years, dying in 323 BCE. It appears that life did not begin well for him because he suffered banishment from Sinope for a crime. His father ran the mint in that city, and father and son were together convicted of debasing the coinage. In Athens, Diogenes attached himself to Antisthenes, persistently following him about though Antisthenes did not want him as a pupil. One source of the name Cynic, which means dog, is that Diogenes was said to follow Antisthenes around like a faithful hound. Other sources for the name came from the lifestyle of an ownerless cur adopted by Diogenes and his curmudgeonly criticism of all things conventional. In Greek, kaion is dog, and kainikos, dog-like. According to Diogenes Laertius, Diogenes had a sparky adversarial relationship with Plato, whom he criticized for having carpets in his house and attending banquets. Treading on Plato's carpets one day, he said, "I trample on the pride of Plato," to which Plato replied, "Yes, Diogenes, with pride of another kind." One story says that Diogenes was later captured by pirates and sold into slavery at Corinth. He was purchased by one Xeniades, who made him tutor to his sons. He became a much-loved member of the family and remained with them until his death. Among many different accounts of the cause of his death is that he was bitten by a dog and died of blood poisoning, an obvious punning tale for the death of a cynic. Although Diogenes is also said to have written books and plays, his views are chiefly expressed in the um, anecdotes of his life, many doubtless apocryphal. One such is that he was visited by Alexander the Great, who offered him anything he wished, to which Diogenes replied, "You can stand out of my sunlight." Diogenes' chief tenet was that one should live simply and naturally, indeed like a dog, and he accordingly urinated and defecated anywhere in public, ate whenever he happened to feel hungry, and observed no taboos about what could be eaten, including food taken from temple sacrifices. He advocated living in complete independence of convention, and described himself as a citizen of the world, a cosmopolitan. He charged his contemporaries with living artificially, their minds befogged or smoky because of the folly of desiring wealth, fame, and honor. The goal of life should be eudaimonia, happiness, and atuphia, clarity of mind, literally unsmokiness, achieved through ascesis, or asceticism, which gives autarkia, self-sufficiency, strength, and peace of mind. This meant living and acting without shame, shamelessly, and spurning the laws of society and the state wherever they conflict with the simple, natural, truly virtuous life. It is noteworthy that whereas others who have rejected society and its artificialities as barriers to virtue, for a later and more familiar example, the Christian desert fathers and hermits, the cynics, did not take themselves into the wilderness in search of their simple life, but lived it in the midst of the city. The Christian hermits went to the desert to escape temptation. Diogenes challenged temptation right in its midst. The point was to encourage people to embrace simplicity and a natural way of living by confronting them with an example of it. And the confrontation was not just by example, but by criticizing, poking fun, embarrassing, and even horrifying people to get them to think. Diogenes might be thought to have had nothing to lose as a criminal, exile, and perhaps later as a slave, in choosing and extolling a dog's existence. The opposite is true of the next in the succession of leading cynics, Crates of Thebes, who was born to great wealth but gave it away, after he had heard and witnessed Diogenes. He said he was a fellow citizen of Diogenes, thus a citizen of the world, and with him repudiated conventionality. Crates and his wife Hipparchia of Aronia, also from a wealthy family, accordingly chose to live as beggars on the streets of Athens. They came to be well known and respected for their good humor and principled stance, and were welcomed everywhere, not least in their role as consolators, soothing family quarrels and settling arguments with kindness. Their version of the simple life was less confrontational than that of Diogenes, and the focus appears to have been more on the ataraxia achievable by freedom from the desires and aims of convention than on attacking people for their adherence to convention. Diogenes Laertius said that Crates' philosophical letters were as beautifully written as Plato's dialogues, but none survive. There are 36 extant letters attributed to him, but they have been shown to be latter forgeries. He enjoyed the philosophical life because it liberates one from dissatisfactions and trouble. When you have money, he said, you can share it liberally. And when you have none, you will not be unhappy about it, but will be pleased with whatever you have. He encouraged people to live on a simple diet of lentils, saying that luxurious living eventually leads to strife, because the reason that people compete for position and wealth is that these are necessary for making a luxurious life possible and for maintaining it thereafter. Crates and Hipparchia are attractive proponents of the claim that simplicity and naturalness are the route to happiness. It is not implausible to suppose that they succeeded in following this route because they had each other's company on the way. Epicureanism. An entire book of Diogenes Laertius' lives is dedicated to Epicurus, and it includes extensive quotations from 3 letters by Epicurus summarizing his views on physics, ethics, and the heavens respectively. Collections of his sayings, documents in the library of the 1st century BCE Epicurean philosopher Philodemus, found under the Vesuvian ashes at Heracleanum, and above all the fine poem De Rerum Natura, On the Nature of Things, written by Lucretius also in the 1st century BCE, give a comprehensive account of the Epicurean theories. Lucretius's poems is an adaptation in hexameter verse of Epicurus's book on nature, Periphrasis. Cicero, writing at the same period as Philodemus and Lucretius, made a critical examination of the Epicurean philosophy in his Tusculan Disputations. The enduring reputation of Epicureanism in the Hellenic and imperial periods is evidenced by the fact that its chief doctrines were inscribed for public benefit on the wall of a portico built in the Lycian city of Oenoanda by another Diogenes in the 2nd century CE. Epicurus was born in 341 BCE in the Athenian colony of Samos and moved to Athens itself at the age of 18 in 323 BCE when the colonists were expelled from Samos following the death of Alexander that year. His interest in philosophy was prompted at the age of 14 when he found that his schoolmasters could not explain the meaning of chaos in the writings of Hesiod. Hesiod wrote before Herodotus. In Athens, he studied with a pupil of Democritus, an atomist, before moving first to Mytilene and then Lampsacus, in both places starting a school and gathering pupils. Eventually, he settled back in Athens, where he bought a garden as a site for his school and lived there until his death at the age of 71. His school was known as the Garden, accordingly. One of the startling things about Diogenes Laertius's life of Epicurus is the lengthy report it contains of the calumny and hostility heaped on the philosopher by his enemies. He was accused of practicing magic and casting spells for a fee, writing scandalous letters, consorting with courtiers, flattering influential people, plagiarizing other philosophers, and devoting himself to luxury and sensual pleasures. It was said that he was bulimic, so that he could eat more, and was so physically feeble that he could hardly rise from his chair, and that he aspersed others, including Aristotle and Heraclitus. He said Aristotle had wasted his patrimony and made money by selling drugs, and that Heraclitus was a muddler. Diogenes Laertius says that those who spoke thus of Epicurus were mad, because everyone else testified to his kindness and goodwill, his generosity, gentleness, piety, consideration for others, and humility, his restraint and frugality, and the famous moderation of the garden's lifestyle. Part, at least, of the hostility felt by some for Epicurus and his school doubtlessly arose from misunderstanding of his view that happiness consists in the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain, which, as we shall see, does not at all mean what it seems to mean, and his rejection of religion. The starting point for Epicurus' philosophy is that the fundamental stuff of nature is matter in the form of atoms, which are individual solid material particles that cannot be divided further. They are too small to be perceived, and they move or fall in the void of empty space, understood as where matter is not. The theory is Democritean, but it incorporates solutions to problems that Aristotle and others had seen in Democritus's theory. For one thing, there was the problem of making sense of the idea of an infinite void. No up or down, no direction. How can anything fall or move in such a space? And for another, as Aristotle argued in Book 6 of his Physics, the idea of a minimum particle of matter is incoherent. For consider, if two such minima cross paths, how could they ever be halfway past each other, given that if they were so, then they are not minima? An implication of Aristotle's view, interestingly, is that if there are minima of matter, then space and time themselves must be quantized. But if atoms are discrete minima, then they do not move continuously but jump from point to point in space and time, and must do so at the same speed. Epicurus' response is ingenious. It is, first, that although atoms are, as their name implies, indivisible, they are not the same thing as the least conceivable amount of matter, that is, the minima. Atoms are composed of minima, but cannot be broken down into them. No minimum of matter can exist independently by itself. As indissoluble aggregates of material minima, atoms have shapes, hooks, and indentations, which is why they can adhere to each other to form larger objects of the kind we perceive. He accepted the idea that time and space consist of discrete quanta, and that all atomic motion occurs at the same speed. These motions cancel out in the aggregations of atoms constituting familiar macroscopic objects, through their collisions and deflections and conjunctions. Atoms are indefinitely various in their shapes, explaining the variety of things built out of them, and they are in continual motion throughout eternity. The atomic theory is the result of noting the implication of two propositions taken together, that what we encounter in experience is complex, that is consists of parts, and that nothing can come from nothing. Therefore, there must be fundamental units of material reality, and for them to move, combine, and decouple, there must be space, a void, for them to move in. The properties of things we perceive, their colors, tastes, and the rest, are caused by the configurations of the atoms constituting them, and how these interact with the configurations of atoms that constitute our sense organs. This latter point is central to Epicurus' theory of mind and perception. Our perceiving, seeing, hearing, and the rest are reliable, Epicurus held, and arise from the interaction between the world and our sense organs, and arise from the interaction between the world and our sense organs. The world is entirely physical. There are no non-physical things, which means in particular that there are no non-physical souls or minds. The word for soul and mind is the same, anima. Our bodies are moved by our minds, and our minds are affected by what happens to our bodies. But neither could occur if minds were not made of the same stuff as bodies. Our souls or minds are accordingly themselves made of material atoms, though they are especially fine ones, which are dispersed throughout our bodies, and we perceive and feel by the causal interactions between the body constituting and mind constituting atoms. When the body dies, these soul atoms are dispersed, and the functions of sensation and thought thereby cease. There is no life after death, and therefore there is nothing to fear in regard to death. Epicurus says, death is nothing to us, for good and evil imply sentience, and death is the privation of all sentience. In Epicurus' celebrated view, the alpha and omega of a blessed life is pleasure. Pleasure is our first and native good. The whole of the Epicurean ethic can be summed up as the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. We get the modern meaning of Epicureanism, indulgence in wine, feasting and partying, devotion to the pleasures of the senses, from a completely erroneous interpretation of what Epicurus meant by his remark. For he immediately goes on to say, quote, we often pass over many pleasures when a greater annoyance arises from them, and we often regard certain pains as preferable to pleasures when in consequence they bring a greater pleasure to us later. We regard being independent of outward things as a great good, not in order always to make use of little, but so that we are not inconvenienced when we do not have much. For they most enjoy luxury who have no need of it, and we know that what is natural is easily procured, while only vain and worthless things are hard to get. Plain food gives as much pleasure as a costly diet. Bread and water confer the highest pleasure when conveyed to hungry lips. To habituate ourselves to a simple and inexpensive diet supplies all that is needful for health and enables us to meet all life's necessities without shrinking. End quote. And that is why he nominates pleasure as the end and aim. We do not mean the pleasures of the prodigal or of sensuality. We mean the absence of pain in the body and trouble in the mind. What produces a pleasant life is sober reasoning, searching out the grounds of every choice, and banishing those things that cause tumults in the mind. Understanding the nature of the world is the ground of this rational view. When we know that the universe is a material realm, we are no longer afraid, as Lucretius points out in his great poem, of our faux religion and superstition, but instead base our view of the world on reason and a clear understanding of reality. Among the difficulties with Epicurus' theory is the problem that its picture of a mechanistic universe raises for the question of free will, a problem that continues to bedevil philosophy today, since everything is determined, but all the more so because the discoveries of neuroscience place mental phenomena ever more securely in the physical realm. And of course we know now that the world is determined and our minds are determined and that there is no free will. But it's an illusion. Free will is an illusion. But Epicurus tried to deal with this by saying that the atoms swerve slightly as they move through the void, giving rise to accident and randomness. But this is not a satisfactory solution, for if our choices are not connected causally to the actions that, as we take it, follow from them, but instead occur randomly or accidentally only, then free will is neither will nor free. One of the greatest pleasures, according to Epicurus, is that of friendship, philia, or philia. Friendship might begin with considerations of the usefulness that people have for each other, but soon develops into a bond of deep and abiding mutual altruism. Following Aristotle's laudatory account of friendship in the Nicomachean Ethics, the concept became a central trope for much practical philosophy, from Epicurus to Cicero, and on through the tradition to E.G. Moore. The process mirrors the evolution of society as Epicurus saw it. In human beings were solitary creatures in the beginning, who over the course of history began to form families and communities, acquiring language and sharing the development of skills such as agriculture and building. There is something in this of the idea of society emerging from an idealized state of nature, as Locke and Rousseau conceived of it much later, when the utility of cooperation was recognized. In course of time, the increasing complexity of society saw the appearance of kings and tyrants, of religion and of fear of punishment. But the true source of justice is the perception of mutual benefit in the keeping of compacts, and the belief that a prudent, honorable, and just life is the most pleasant one. If everyone lived by this ideal, Epicurus said, then there would never be tyranny, and no need of religion, because society itself would be good. For Epicurus, the chief purpose of philosophy is to help people see what the best kind of life is, and why it is so. Philosophy is an education of the mind and a therapy for the soul. Quote, if philosophy does not heal the soul, it is as bad as a medicine that does not heal the body. End quote. The happy life is the life of ataraxia, peace of mind, and one achieves it through philosophical understanding of the true nature of things, and by living in conformity with that understanding.